She was the daughter they did not speak of, the daughter that brought them shame. Born into America's most celebrated family, Rosemary was expected to smile, to charm, to embody perfection. But in the shadows of the glittering public image, she struggled. Words slower to form, steps slower to follow, thoughts that wandered where the family's ambitions could not. In the Kennedy world, weakness was not forgiven. Her differences became an unspoken burden, a flaw to be hidden from the photographers, from the party guests, from history itself. She was moved, shifted, placed out of sight, always with a polite explanation, always wrapped in the language of protection. But beneath the courtesy was something colder: shame. And in time, that shame drove her father to do the unthinkable, ordering a surgeon to cut into her brain, hoping to erase what he could not accept. Decades later, her absence would be noticed, but by then, the truth would be buried behind locked doors, sealed files, and the kind of silence that can only be born from a family's fear of imperfection. This is the story of how that silence destroyed her. The Kennedy home at 83 Beale Street in Brookline was a place built for appearances. The brass was polished, the curtains pressed, and the family portrait always ready to be summoned at a moment's notice. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy believed a home should reflect order and discipline, the same qualities she demanded from her children. But on September 13, 1918, in the shadow of the Great War, and as influenza crept through Boston streets, the order cracked for just a moment. Rose's contractions began before dawn. The doctor was late. The nurse, anxious to stall the delivery until his arrival, pressed on Rose's legs and held the baby inside for hours. It was an unrecorded delay, but one that may have starved the infant's brain of oxygen in her first moments of life. The baby girl, Rosemary Kennedy, called Rosemary, entered the world without the fanfare that would greet later Kennedy arrivals. She was healthy enough to pass inspection, her dark eyes wide and searching, her mother relieved. No one noticed that something in her start to life had been off. Not yet. Rosemary grew into a smiling toddler, docile and eager for affection. But even in the sanctuary of the nursery, subtle differences emerged. She crawled months later than her brothers had. Her first steps came haltingly. At the dinner table, she fumbled with her spoon long after her younger siblings had mastered the ritual. Rose wrote these things off as a matter of temperament. Still, deep down, she began to feel the creeping suspicion that her third child was not like the others. In another family, that difference might have been allowed to rest quietly, folded into the fabric of everyday life. But the Kennedys were not another family. They were already building something, a dynasty, even if they didn't yet call it that. Joe Kennedy's ambition was a living thing in the house, an atmosphere as present as air. There would be no weak links. His sons would lead nations, his daughters would marry power. Every Kennedy child was to be an emblem of success. From her earliest school days, Rosemary found herself out of step. She struggled to memorize letters, to follow the rhythm of lessons. Her peers advanced. She repeated grades. Teachers noted her difficulties in careful coded language. Slow, easily distracted, needs extra help. In the 1920s, such words carried weight, and not the sympathetic kind. To be labeled was to be diminished. Rose, fiercely protective of the family's image, resisted the suggestion of special schools. She'll be fine, she insisted, as much to herself as to the teachers. Public school kept Rosemary in the stream of normalcy, even if she was always swimming against the current. But the other children noticed. Classmates teased her for falling behind, for not knowing the answer, for moving clumsily in games. At home, she sat apart while her siblings chattered over politics and history at the dinner table, the conversation leaping over her head. And yet, Rosemary tried. Always, she tried. She beamed at praise, clung to small triumphs, and carried herself with a grace that sometimes fooled strangers into thinking she was simply shy. But inside the Kennedy home, her differences were an unspoken fact, something to be managed, contained, and when necessary, concealed. The first shadow of shame had entered the Kennedy household. It was faint then, no more than a whisper behind closed doors. But in a family where image was survival, even the smallest flaw could grow into something dangerous. By the autumn of 1923, Rosemary Kennedy was 5 years old and ready, at least in her mother's eyes, for kindergarten at Edward Devotion School in Brookline. Rose dressed her in a crisp pinafore and tied her hair in perfect bows, sending her off with the same pride she felt for Joe Jr. and Jack. But unlike her brothers, Rosemary did not return home with stories of what she had learned. Her teacher's notes were polite but pointed. Rosemary could not keep pace with her classmates. She stumbled over the alphabet, confused numbers, forgot instructions halfway through a task. During group reading, she would stare at the page, mouthing sounds that never formed into words. The schoolyard was worse. She tripped over jump ropes, swung a bat seconds too late, missed the rhythm of clapping games. When she lost, she laughed too loudly, too long, her way of hiding the sting. But her laughter only made her a stranger to them. In photographs from those years, Rosemary's smile is wide, but her position is telling, often at the edge of the frame, a half step behind the others. By the time she was 8, the gap had widened. Her brothers and sisters moved ahead in school, joined sports teams, earned prizes. Rosemary was still struggling to write her name in a straight line. She held her pencil in a tight, awkward grip that left smudges across the page. Reading aloud was agony. She stumbled over simple words, flushing when her brothers corrected her. Rose kept records on every child. Rosemary's file was thinner. The entries were vague, her achievements more about effort than mastery. In one note, Rose wrote, "Rosie is cheerful, helpful in the kitchen." It was a kind assessment, but it said everything about where expectations had been set. By 1927, Joe Kennedy's fortunes had soared. The family moved to Riverdale, New York, into a sprawling home that signaled their arrival among the East Coast elite. For Rosemary, the move meant starting over, again. A new school, new classmates, new teachers who quickly realized she could not keep up. The polite suggestions returned, perhaps a private tutor, perhaps a different program. This time, Rose agreed. Rosemary was withdrawn from school and taught at home. She learned sewing, simple cooking, how to set a formal table. The lessons were meant to prepare her for the life of a proper young lady. But the walls of the Kennedy home became a quiet prison, shutting her away from the messy business of growing up with peers. When she was allowed out, it was with supervision. A companion accompanied her to the shops, to church, to dances. Rosemary was not to be left alone, not because she might be harmed, but because she might speak, act, or react in ways that drew notice. The Kennedys could not afford notice of that kind. The shame was still unspoken, but it had taken on form. It shaped her days, dictated where she went, and, more painfully, where she did not. While her siblings roamed freely, making friends and chasing their ambitions, Rosemary learned the quiet skill of disappearing when it was convenient for everyone else. In the autumn of 1939, war broke over Europe, and the Kennedy household in London began its retreat. Joe Kennedy arranged for nearly all his children to return to the safety of the United States. All except one. Rosemary stayed. The official explanation was that she was thriving in England, happier, more capable than she had been in years. The truth, however, was more complicated. Rosemary was 20 years old and enrolled at the Assumption Convent at Belmont House in Kent, where the Montessori approach had given her something rare: stability. Her days were ordered and predictable. She helped younger pupils in the classroom, supervised them in the garden, served their morning meals. For a young woman who had spent her life in the exhausting churn of institutions, failed placements, and new starts, Belmont House was a sanctuary. Her father visited when his ambassadorial duties allowed. He told her she was special, that she had been chosen to stay because he needed her there. Rosemary believed him. In letters home, she spoke with pride about being his companion in England. She signed her notes with affection and gratitude, certain that she had been set apart for a reason. Joe's attention was not unnoticed. Those close to the family would later recall that his control over his daughters, and Rosemary in particular, could be unsettling. Decades later, some former acquaintances and researchers would quietly raise a darker possibility: that his interest in her was not only paternal. These claims remain unproven, but in the shadow of her isolation they linger, adding an edge of unease to the decision that kept her in England long after her siblings had gone. At Belmont House, her confidence began to grow. Mother Isabel, the nun in charge of her training, wrote of her progress, her improved manners, her efforts to think of others before herself, her habit of coming to her teacher whenever she felt upset. She was learning to manage her frustrations, to see herself as capable. For a short while, Rosemary felt valued. But even as he praised her, Joe was making decisions about her future that she would never be allowed to contest. He told Rose in a private letter that Rosemary must never be at home, for her own good and for everyone else's. She could be useful here, under watch, but she would not be reabsorbed into the public life of the Kennedy family. By mid-1940, the war was closing in. German advances on the continent made it clear that she could not remain in Britain indefinitely. Joe arranged for her to return via Lisbon, escorted by family friends. When she arrived in the United States, the secure order of Belmont House was gone. The Kennedy household in Bronxville was a place of constant motion, athletic contests, political debates, and unspoken competition for attention. Rosemary, with her slower pace and difficulty following the conversation, was once again the one left on the margins. Her mother enrolled her in a summer camp in Massachusetts. Staff there had not been told of her needs. Within weeks, they found her wandering the grounds at night. Her shoes were too small, leaving her feet blistered and bleeding. She was sent home early, but Rose did not come to collect her, preferring to remain at a spa in Maine. Instead, a family associate was dispatched to manage her return. Next came St. Gertrude's, a boarding school in Washington, D.C. for girls with significant learning difficulties. At 22, Rosemary was older than most of the students. Here, her restlessness grew. She slipped out at night, sometimes more than once a week. Whether she was searching for someone, trying to find her way back to a place she recognized, or fleeing from something that frightened her, no one could say. In public, Rose spoke of disquieting symptoms. In private, Joe began searching for a permanent solution, something that would remove the uncertainty she represented, and the risk she posed to the Kennedy image. At the time, a handful of American physicians were promoting an experimental brain operation they claimed could calm disruptive patients. It was being used primarily on women described as moody, unstable, or overly sexual. Joe asked his daughter Kathleen to discreetly learn more. She returned appalled and advised against it. Rose agreed. But Joe's mind was not changed. In November 1941, he told Rosemary they would be going to meet a doctor, a brilliant man, he said, who could help her. It would be their secret, something not even her mother would know. Rosemary agreed without question. Her loyalty to him was absolute. Some who knew the family would later look back on that loyalty, and on Joe's pattern of isolating her, moving her far from siblings, keeping her dependent on his approval, and wonder if the decision he made next had less to do with help than with control. It was the day after Thanksgiving when Rosemary walked into the hospital in Washington. She believed she was taking the first step toward becoming what her father wanted her to be. She did not know that she would never leave the building the same. It was the morning after Thanksgiving, November 28, 1941. Washington's streets were cold and still, the country's attention turned toward the holiday weekend. Inside the Kennedy household, there was no hint of celebration. Joe Kennedy had made arrangements in secret, not with his wife, not with his other children, but with two doctors he believed could solve the problem of his eldest daughter once and for all. Rosemary was told only that they were going to meet a highly respected physician. She had been here before. Visits to doctors had been part of her life since childhood, and she did not question her father's instructions. She wanted to please him. She always wanted to please him. Over the years, she had clung to his approval as proof that she mattered. The hospital they entered that day was not one of the sprawling public institutions she had known in the past. It was George Washington University Hospital, a private, polished building where the corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and the walls muffled every sound. There was no sign of her mother, no sisters waiting to see her through. This was Joe's arrangement, and Joe's alone. The doctors, neurologist Dr. Walter Freeman and neurosurgeon Dr. James Watts, had been promoting a new surgical procedure, the prefrontal lobotomy. They claimed it could calm agitation, control impulsive behavior, and make a patient more manageable. The reality was less certain. Even among colleagues, the operation was controversial. Results ranged from mild improvement to complete and permanent disability. But Freeman was persuasive, and Joe was convinced. Rosemary was brought into the operating room. There was no mask, no drifting into unconsciousness. In 1941, lobotomies were often performed with the patient awake so the surgeons could test their mental function as they worked. Her head was secured to the table. A section of her dark, wavy hair was clipped away. 2 small burr holes were drilled into her skull, one on each side near the temples. Dr. Watts guided a slender instrument through the first opening, sliding it toward the frontal lobes, the part of the brain involved in decision-making, personality, and self-control. As he worked, Dr. Freeman spoke to her, asking her to sing, to recite the Lord's Prayer, to count backward from 100. They were listening for signs that her responses were slowing, that her words were breaking apart. That was their measure of success. The questions continued. Her answers became less certain. A song faltered halfway through. She stumbled over numbers. At that moment, they stopped on the left side and began again on the right. The entire procedure took less than an hour. When it was over, Rosemary was still breathing, still conscious. But something in her had gone quiet. The change was not subtle. Her speech was slurred, then almost gone. She could no longer control her movements. Within days, it became clear she had lost the ability to walk without help, to feed herself, to manage even the smallest daily tasks. The young woman who had been presented to royalty, who had danced, swum, laughed, and argued in her own halting way, had been reduced to the mental capacity of a toddler. Joe Kennedy did not stay at her side. He did not summon Rose to the hospital until after the surgery was complete, and even then, the explanation was vague. Rosemary, he said, had suffered a setback. No details. In the weeks that followed, the family crafted a public story. Rosemary was away, working in another state, helping to teach children with disabilities. It was a fiction that would endure for decades. Her siblings were told little, if anything. Letters from their mother mentioned each child by name, except Rosemary. When she was well enough to be moved, Rosemary was transferred to Craig House, a private psychiatric facility in New York's Hudson Valley. It was a quiet place, discreet, with long driveways and tall trees that screened it from the road. She would stay there for 7 years, learning in fragments how to sit up, how to move one foot in front of the other, how to lift a spoon again. She would never return to the Kennedy household. The decision made that November morning had erased her from its daily life. And for the family's public story, it was almost as if she had never been there at all. Craig House stood far from public view, hidden among the wooded hills of Beacon, New York. It was a place designed for discretion, a converted estate with manicured grounds and shuttered windows, its name absent from any sign. For families of means, it offered privacy above all else. This was where Joe Kennedy sent Rosemary in the winter of 1941. She arrived in a wheelchair, her face pale, her speech limited to short, hesitant sounds. Her movements were awkward, often requiring 2 attendants to help her from bed to chair. She could no longer dress herself, bathe without assistance, or control basic bodily functions. What the doctors had done in less than an hour had taken from her decades of independence she had fought to hold on to. The change was so sudden, so complete, that the staff at Craig House would later struggle to imagine who she had been before. In her medical file, there was no record of the curtsy before the King and Queen, no mention of the London finishing school, no trace of the girl who had once swum for hours in the sea. Now she was classified only by her deficits. Joe Kennedy oversaw her care with the same distance and efficiency he applied to his business ventures. Bills were paid promptly, instructions relayed through secretaries, but he visited rarely. For the outside world, he crafted the fiction that Rosemary was working at a school in the Midwest, teaching children with intellectual disabilities. It was a story neat enough to deflect curiosity and kind enough to end the questions quickly. In the Kennedy narrative, she had been edited out. At Craig House, Rosemary's world shrank to the daily routine of institutional life. Breakfast served on a tray, mornings in the therapy room, short walks in the garden when weather allowed. She had a small collection of picture books, some gifted by the staff, which she would turn through slowly, studying faces she did not know. Visitors were rare, and she learned not to expect them. For the family, the silence served its purpose. In those years, Joe Jr. was being groomed for the presidency. Jack was rising in Congress. Kathleen was making her debut in British society. Eunice was carving out her own path in public service. There was no place in the official image for the daughter whose existence raised questions they did not want to answer. The years passed this way, quiet, repetitive, unchanging. The seasons turned in the hills above the Hudson. Staff came and went. Rosemary stayed. She would remain at Craig House for 7 years before Joe moved her again. Rosemary would be moved from Craig House in New York to St. Coletta, a Catholic residential institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin. The facility was run by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi and cared for people with lifelong intellectual and physical disabilities. The choice was strategic. St. Coletta was far from the Kennedy homes on the East Coast and even further from the scrutiny of Washington. Its grounds were sprawling and wooded, its cottages tucked away from the main road. It was a place where someone could disappear into routine without attracting attention. By the time she arrived, Rosemary was 31 years old. She had regained a limited ability to walk, but only with assistance and great effort. Her speech remained slow and difficult, often limited to single words or short phrases. Her emotions were unpredictable. She could be affectionate one moment and withdrawn the next, frustrated by the gaps between thought and expression. St. Coletta's staff gave her a small cottage of her own, staffed by nuns and aides. They established a rigid schedule: wake up at 6:30 a.m., meals at the same times each day, occupational therapy, religious services, light recreation. Activities were kept simple: balloon volleyball in place of competitive games, swimming with a therapist in the small pool on the grounds, short walks along the garden paths. Her parents rarely visited. Joe's control over her life remained total, even as his own health began to falter. Correspondence with the institution flowed through his secretaries. Decisions about her care were made without her input. For the rest of the world, and even for many relatives, Rosemary's whereabouts and condition were not discussed. But in the 1950s and early 1960s, the silence began to crack. Her brother John, now a rising political figure, visited her for the first time in more than a decade while campaigning in the Midwest. The meeting left him shaken. It was one thing to know a sibling was away and not well. It was another to see in person the result of the lobotomy. Slowly, other siblings began to come. Eunice in particular formed a bond with her sister, visiting regularly and speaking publicly, though carefully, about the rights and needs of people with intellectual disabilities. These visits did not erase the years of absence, but they marked a change. Rosemary was still hidden from the public, but within the family, she was no longer entirely forgotten. Her life at St. Coletta would continue with little outward change for decades. The routines were unbroken, the seasons turning in quiet repetition. The world outside moved on. Presidents were elected and assassinated. Movements rose and fell. Her brothers and sisters became some of the most famous people in America. Rosemary remained where she was, living each day in the shadow of a decision made without her consent. And though she could not have known it, her existence, and the truth of what had been done to her, would one day shape one of the Kennedys' most enduring public legacies. In the years after the surgery, the world around Rosemary surged forward, carrying with it everyone who had shaped her life, while she remained exactly where her father had left her. For Joe Kennedy, the lobotomy was an act of closure. He had taken decisive action as he saw it and eliminated the uncertainty Rosemary represented. But the price was her absence. He rarely visited her at Craig House and later at St. Coletta, choosing instead to focus on his surviving ambitions, his son's political futures. He returned to private life after his ambassadorship ended in 1940, but his influence never waned. Joe poured his energy into grooming Joe Jr. for the presidency, then Jack as his second option. When a stroke in 1961 left him unable to speak or walk, the power he had wielded so easily was gone. But Rosemary's fate, which he had decided alone, remained unchanged. Rose Kennedy kept her distance. She had not been consulted before the surgery, and when she was told afterward, she accepted the official explanation that it had been necessary. Publicly, she spoke of her large family in the glowing, orderly terms. Rosemary's name was conspicuously absent. She visited infrequently in the early years, preferring to write about her daughter in her autobiography decades later as having suffered an accident. Even in private correspondence, she avoided the details. Rose maintained her public role as matriarch, her composure intact, her faith unshaken, at least in appearance. The eldest son and original heir to his father's ambitions, Joe Jr. served as a Navy pilot during World War II. He died in 1944 during a secret mission over Europe when his plane exploded mid-flight. Rosemary, already institutionalized, was never told the details. She only knew her brother was gone. John F. Kennedy, the second son, stepped into the role his father had reserved for Joe Jr. His political rise was swift. Congress in 1947, the Senate in 1953, the presidency in 1961. The demands of his public life left little room for private reckoning with Rosemary's fate, though his 1960 campaign brought him into the Midwest, where he visited her for the first time in years. As president, he signed significant legislation to support people with intellectual disabilities, work influenced, at least in part, by what he had seen. Robert F. Kennedy became his brother's Attorney General in 1961 and one of his closest political advisors. He, too, eventually visited Rosemary at St. Coletta. Though he rarely spoke about her in public, those close to him noted that the encounter stayed with him. After JFK's assassination, Bobby carried forward some of the initiatives on disability policy, another quiet legacy of the sister left behind. Eunice Kennedy Shriver's bond with Rosemary deepened after Joe's stroke. She began visiting her more often, bringing her own children and spending unhurried time in her cottage. In 1968, Eunice founded the Special Olympics, a direct outgrowth of her belief that people with intellectual disabilities could thrive if given opportunity and respect. She acknowledged Rosemary's influence on her work, though she never publicly detailed what had happened in 1941. Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy was one of Rosemary's closest companions before the war, often smoothing her entry into social gatherings. In 1944, while living in England, Kick married William Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, against her family's wishes. He was killed in combat 4 months later. 4 years later, Kick died in a plane crash in France. Rosemary, institutionalized, would never attend her funeral. Edward "Ted" Kennedy was only 9 when Rosemary was sent away. As he grew into his role as a senator, he became one of the most vocal legislative champions for disability rights in Congress, carrying forward the work his sister Eunice began. By then, Rosemary's story was partially known, though still shrouded in the family's preferred language of illness and special care. Dr. Walter Freeman continued to promote the lobotomy well into the 1950s, often performing it with his controversial ice pick technique. By the time the procedure fell out of favor, thousands of Americans had undergone it, many with outcomes as devastating as Rosemary's. Dr. James Watts distanced himself from Freeman in later years, criticizing the indiscriminate use of the surgery. Neither man publicly acknowledged Rosemary Kennedy's case. While each of them moved forward, to power, to war, to tragedy, to reinvention, Rosemary stayed where she had been left. Her world remained a small cottage in rural Wisconsin, her days shaped by the hands of nurses and nuns, her future defined by a decision she had never been allowed to refuse. For more than 2 decades after the lobotomy, Rosemary Kennedy's existence was almost entirely hidden. By the 1980s, the Kennedy myth was no longer invulnerable. Biographers began digging deeper, aided by former family staff and acquaintances who were willing to speak off the record. The story of the lobotomy emerged in fragments, first as rumor, then as documented fact. It was shocking, even in an age more familiar with medical overreach. The image of a powerful father approving experimental brain surgery on his daughter without her consent and without her mother's knowledge was impossible to reconcile with the polished photographs of smiling family gatherings. The Kennedys did not deny the story, but they controlled how it was told. Public statements framed the surgery as an ill-fated attempt to help, a decision made in a different time with different understanding. Even then, Rosemary herself remained out of sight. There were no press interviews, no public appearances. In her final decades, Rosemary's life at St. Coletta was consistent, comfortable within its limits. She continued to swim with assistants, enjoyed music, and attended daily Mass. She could still say simple prayers, and the word Jesus always drew her attention. Her siblings visited more often in these years. These visits were carefully managed to protect her routine. 1 or 2 relatives at a time, familiar voices, familiar gestures. Rosemary responded to these visits in ways that showed memory still lived somewhere inside her. Photographs of her younger self would hold her gaze. She recognized faces, sometimes reaching for a hand without being prompted. When a television broadcast showed an award ceremony or gala, she would look intently, as if recognizing the stage lights and evening gowns from another life. On January 7, 2005, Rosemary Kennedy died at Fort Atkinson Memorial Hospital, not far from St. Coletta. She was 86 years old. Eunice, John, Pat, and Ted were at her side. The news was met with tributes that focused on her role in inspiring the family's work in disability rights. The obituaries spoke of her smile, her kindness, her influence on the Special Olympics. Few dwelled on the decision in 1941 that had taken her independence. That detail, even 64 years later, was still handled with caution. She was buried in Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts, the same place her life had begun. In the end, Rosemary's story became 2 stories. One was the official legacy, a woman whose life inspired a global movement, whose family used its influence to improve the lives of millions with disabilities. The other was the truth. A young woman hidden, altered against her will, and left to live out her years behind walls she had never chosen. The family's name remains tied to the cause she symbolized, but her absence, the decades erased from public view, tells a quieter story about power, image, and the cost of perfection. She was the daughter they did not speak of, and while the world now knows her name, the silence that once surrounded her still lingers, an echo of the day her voice was taken away.